Thank you for coming, especially for finding the room. Appreciate that. After the reading, our speaker will take questions, and then we do have books for sale out front, which he would be happy to sign for you. So, happy National Poetry Month to you, and thank you again for coming to tonight's event in the Department of English, Rhetoric, and Writing's reading series. Tonight's reading is sponsored by Berry College and the Georgia Poetry Circuit. It's my honor now to introduce to you Andrea Hollander. Andrea Hollander is the author of 4 full-length poetry collections, including most recently Landscape with Female Figure, a finalist for the 2014 Oregon Book Award. Her many honors include 2 fellowships from the National Endowment for the Arts, the Nicholas Roerich Poetry Prize, the D.H. Lawrence Fellowship, a Pushcart Prize for Memoir, and fellowships from the Arts Councils of both Arkansas and Oregon. For 22 years, Hollander was the writer-in-residence at Lyon College, where she won the Williamson Prize for Teaching Excellence. In Portland, Oregon, where she has lived since 2011, she teaches writing workshops at the Attic Institute and Mountain Writers Series. Her website is andreahollander.net. I've always tried to write as clearly as possible in language that is free of decoration, Hollander has said, noting that a poem is already by its nature a dense enterprise. Relatively few words attempt to engage readers and provide a compelling experience. And while I don't wish to write simplistic poems, I do want readers to easily enter a poem and to discover there something valuable, not only the first time they read or hear it, but for them to want to enter the poem again and again and to be ushered more deeply into it each time. But while Hollander's poems do create a clear, accessible surface, they do so by recognizing the complexity of human lives and relationships, often exploring the contrast between surface illusion and deeper realities. As one poem speaker notes, being a child means being too young to understand that words could be sod laid over something dark and unuttered. To become of age, then, one might say, is to recognize how much can be accomplished, how much hidden, how much laid bare with language, both in our lives and on the page. And these poems are very much concerned with the hidden in our lives. In one poem, the speaker describes her husband in the cashmere sweater I'd bought him, smiling and wide-eyed for the picture I took the day before I caught him. In another, grandparents who arrived disguised as harmless elders. In still another, the bruise the speaker kept hidden, yellowing now, not yelling the way I couldn't until I could. I write to discover and understand something about what makes humans human. Andrea Hollander has also said, good poetry ought to be both entertaining, rooted in the human traditions of making music and telling stories, and useful, capable of disturbing our lives enough to reinforce our humanness, she believes. And that ability to disturb our lives so that we recognize the flaws and strengths that we share that make us human is a core strength of Hollander's poems. As one speaker puts it, referring to the history of her one scar, I scraped my foot against the reef. You know how it is when something so startles you into your life, you forget you're anything but eyes or ears or mouth. It doesn't have to hurt. I'm talking about swells of music your bones recognize, or the first drop of honey on the tongue. These poems are not decorations, but their beautifully insightful surfaces bring us into the essential. Please welcome now Andrea Hollander.
Well, thank you, Sandy, for that intelligent and insightful introduction. It's always interesting to hear someone else tell you what you've done and get it right, or at least get what I was hoping you would get. You did. So I've met some of you before, and not all of you, before meaning a few hours ago. And that was a delight. This is just such a beautiful campus. And obviously, those of you who work here are lucky, and those of you who chose to come here and were chosen to come here are very fortunate as well. So I thank you for being here tonight. I know this is a very busy time of the year. I don't know why April has to be Poetry Month, and why not have September be Poetry Month, something where we're doing beginnings instead of endings of semesters. So my book is a new and selected, meaning that there's new poems and a selection of poems from my previous 3 books. So it's 4 sections, starting with the most recent poetry and working its way backwards to my early poems. But what I thought I'd do tonight is read you samples from each of those sections, but I'll read them chronologically, which is not the way I put them in the book. So I'm going to go from the back to the front, and I'm going to read 15 poems. They're not all, none of them are really long poems, so I won't keep you here all night. And I'm going to end with 2 poems that are not in the book that are going to be in my forthcoming book. So I'm going to start out with a poem that came from an assignment I gave my students when I was teaching at Lyon College in the Ozarks of Arkansas. And one of the assignments I gave students was to begin or end a poem with lines from Shakespeare. And when I give an assignment, I always try it myself, but I always up the ante a little bit. I make it a little harder, more challenging for myself. So my poem, the assignment I gave myself, you'll hear in the title of the poem. Beginning and ending with lines from Shakespeare. Whoever made us believe that all the world's a stage must have known we'd drive as slowly as the car would go past the aftermath of the accident. One young man holding another man's head above the reddened pavement. A woman still in the passenger seat holding her shoulder. Another, her hair in pink plastic curlers, pacing that brief space between the cars, her eyes crazy, her little boy in her arms, her girl trying to slow her down. Whoever made us believe must have known we would save that scene, however brief, save even the sky's cumulus relief of gray against gray against gray, that against our wills we'd take it all home and play it again when we were most alone, waiting by a telephone in a hallway, praying him home, praying that other day's images away, not wanting to see anymore the quick white bone jutting through the man's leg as he lay with his head in the other man's arms, not wanting over and over to hear that ambulance racing to save not only him. We believe we are more important than they, that this cannot really happen to us. This is a game, we insist. The next car we hear will be his pulling in. This is only a stage, and all the men and women merely players. Well, I was talking this afternoon to the poetry class about the fact that I don't know where I'm going to go when I begin a poem. I did know I was going to begin with a line from Shakespeare, and I knew I had to find another line to end with, but I actually didn't pick that other line out, nor did I expect in that poem that I would be driving by a car accident. And haven't we all done that? Tried not to look and you keep being pulled. The other thing I gave myself for that assignment, but I didn't want to tell you ahead of time because I didn't want you to be listening for it, but these were in quatrains, 4-line stanzas, and there was a rhyme pattern, but I use a lot of what's called slant rhyme, so you're not hearing it hitting you on the head all the time. Okay, so that's a poem from the last part of the book, which was really from my first book, House Without a Dreamer. And maybe you've had this experience. I imagine that you've had a breakup in your life. Maybe not. Maybe you've been so lucky you fell in love and you're still in love and it'll never end. But you know about people who've had breakups. And perhaps what happens to you, which is what has happened to me anytime that has happened, is you get over it over time. But then sometimes something like this happens. When you hear his name unexpectedly, long after you have claimed it wouldn't mean anything, you know you have found the one name you can never say, never even bear to hear, even if it is now someone else's name, a neighbor's child and his mother snapping it at him like a whip. You try to make that sound just a white sheet the wind slaps on that taut line. But you become that line, holding everything above the earth, stretched house to post and back again to house. Or you are the post, placed only to hold the laundry up, keep the line straight. You are not the house, not a thing someone can enter. Yeah, that's how it feels, doesn't it? You can be the post, you can be the line, you can't be the house. So I was also telling students this morning that one of the ways I became a poet, I suppose, or what initiated my life as a poet, was the death of my mother at age 51. She was 51, I was 23. And I was very close with her, and anyone's first death, as another poet has said, there is no other. So the next poem you're going to hear is one that I wrote after that death. It's called Weeds. Weeds. Those of you who have books, I see you're looking, so it's 149 if you like looking at the words as well as hearing them. Weeds. The last time I saw my mother alive, I remember driving the familiar miles to the hospital, sensing that this might be the last time, and suddenly seeing everything as if I'd never see it again. Houses, yards, fences, trees, weeds that grew up along the edge of one driveway where I waited for the light. It had been weeks this time, and now she'd stopped eating. There were dandelions on the hospital grounds and crabgrass and pigweed. I remembered the necklace she showed me how to make once from dandelion flowers. The clouds made shadows on the walkway. The elevator smelled like medicine and powder. In the bed, my mother slept. Her breath was uneven, and I wondered if she dreamed. The room was filled with greenhouse flowers. I wore that necklace for hours until it grew too limp to keep. It's interesting to me as I was putting this book together to see how often I returned to my mother and her passing, but not only to her passing. There were plenty of poems that were about joys in her life. But this next poem is not about my mother. This is a poem that came about after I read a novel called Transferences by the novelist James Twiggs. It was a very, very funny novel about a very serious subject, therapy. This was about a very bad therapist. And after reading it, I realized I had my own story to tell. So this poem is called Therapy. 158 for those of you who are looking at the book. Years back, when I thought I needed that kind of listener, I paid a therapist enough to call her mine and sat in her velvet chair an hour each time and watched that hour die. and watched her face, and through her window just behind I watched the haze of Boston's sky, which was so alive I thought it watched me back as I spoke my mind, and it pulled clouds across her frame from gray to darker gray. That kind of hour is like a dream, and even now I keep remembering more the way she seemed so like a cat, stretching, purring, preening, as she sat with her shoes off and her legs curled up, and sometimes touched her mouth, and sometimes scratched her brow. I remember that more than anything she did or did not say. She did not save me. She may have tried. I was lost to time and men, and in my 20s then I kept mistaking time alone for emptiness. And then one day she fell asleep and even snored, my voice a drone, the sky a storm, insulted, scared, cured. I guessed that was that. I tiptoed out and took the streetcar home and got a cat. You're supposed to laugh at that moment. And I did. I did go home, and it's all a true story, and I did go get a cat, and I didn't get another therapist for 20 years. But I got my revenge 15 years after the incident by writing that poem. Okay, so those are a handful of poems from House Without a Dreamer, and then the second book of mine is called The Other Life, and I'm going to read 2 poems from The Other Life. The first one came to me, well, it didn't come to me, but I came to it after realizing that I had been in love with a poem by a poet. The poet's name is Robert Hayden. The poem is called Those Winter Sundays, and how many are familiar with that poem by title? Well, I knew what one of you would be. Okay, so I'll tell you just a little bit about that poem. Robert Hayden, who was the first African-American to be named what we now call a poet laureate. This was in the early 1970s. And he wrote a poem, a love poem for his father. As an adult, thinking back about his childhood, which evidently from the poem you pick up the idea that there were, as he says, chronic angers in that house. He realizes as an adult that when he was a child he didn't appreciate the kinds of things his father did for the family, for him, polishing his Sunday shoes, making sure the house was warm in the wintertime, even on a Sunday morning. And at the end of Hayden's poem he says, "What did I know? What did I know of love's austere and lonely offices?" Well, that was a very stirring and important poem to me, and I decided if he could write a poem that's a love poem for his father, I would write a love poem for my father. His is called Those Winter Sundays, and you're about to hear Those Summer Sundays. Sundays, my father would join us at the club pool. This is page 99. His skin white and delicate as cigarette paper on the one day he took from the women who lined his waiting room month after month. I waited in the shallow end. He rose from the board and dropped straight as a table knife without a splash. Always the women stared, women from whose bodies he had pulled daughters, released sons. And never would he surface until he had maneuvered through the depths to the place where I stood. Giddy, I would close my eyes as he hoisted me from the flawless water on his shoulders, the two of us, one thing, perfect and tall. I did not know then of the sometimes dangerous entrances of men, how some will lift what others slowly drown. When I was in high school, I had the privilege of taking 4 years of Latin. How many here have studied Latin? A couple, two. Okay, two is 2 out of about a dozen. That's not too bad anymore. Is there Latin available at this campus? No, but you had it somewhere. Okay. Well, I fell in love with the poet Horace after reading him and translating him in my senior year. And there was one poem, and I'm sure I mistranslated it, I've been told, but I liked my mistranslation enough that I believed that he meant it that way. And so when I became a writer enough to think about the fact that I could actually bring that poem, or at least that gesture of his poem, into one of my poems, I did it. So this poem is called Love Song Ending with a Line by Horace. And I think when you hear that ending, you'll know why I wanted it repeated somewhere in the 20th century and now the 21st. What the eye sees with its magic attachments when you look at him and he looks back. What the ear hears when its words are not words at all, but the wild birds of another's heart. What the mouth knows but cannot speak. What the cheek feels when the lashes of his eyes play upon it a secret music. When the limbs sigh as the body lies anticipating, and the mouth knows but cannot speak. And the hands that want everything for themselves and won't be spared and won't be told to stop. And the mouth knows but will not speak. What the heart has had, no fingers of any hand will hold. What the heart has had, no fingers of any hand will hold. I thought that was right. And I think you know what it feels like to have something in your heart that you can't express in any way. So those were 2 poems from The Other Life. The third book I wrote is called Woman in the Painting. And I will read just a couple of poems from there. This one's on 82. Tiny spider in the bathroom sink. I tried to be careful. It lounged along the left side of the bowl, the smallest I've ever seen, a dot with legs, an asterisk. I turned the water only slightly on and aimed the thin stream directly toward the drain and watched the spider squat on all 8 minuscule legs and raise itself again. But after I brushed my teeth the full 2 minutes to appease my dentist and held the foamy brush under the water and flicked the bristles with my thumb to help release the minty suds, I forgot it was there and opened the faucet full force and rinsed my mouth and spat and saw too late the dark speck spiraling down. And I began to understand how it happened that after the doctor announced the bleak diagnosis and looked down at his silent desk, my father said, as if it were someone else whose life and death they were discussing, "Oh, isn't that sad?" So, as you may have understood, my father was being given a diagnosis of Alzheimer's. And so once you actually have enough Alzheimer's and to be recognized, it's almost as if, from what I understand of the awful disease, it's almost as if you are talking. It couldn't possibly be me, it's somebody else. So that was, my father was 79 when that diagnosis happened, and he didn't die till he was 91, so it was a very long and very sad, losing one's sense of self for over a long period of time. Well, my mother had died when she was 51, and about a year later my father met someone and married her, a woman named Evelyn. And Evelyn took great care of my father when he had Alzheimer's. They were married longer than my mother and father were married. So he was lucky. He had 2 really great marriages. And this next poem is about my father, but it's actually a love poem for my stepmother, as you'll hear. It's called Living Room. It's on page 85. Living Room. In the cave of memory, my father crawls now, his small carbide light fixed to his forehead, his knee pads so worn from the journey they're barely useful, but he adjusts them again and again. Sometimes he arches up, stands, reaches, measures himself against the wayward height of the ceiling, which in this part of the cave is at best uneven. He often hits his head. Other times, he suddenly stoops, winces, calls out a name, sometimes the pet name he had for my long-dead mother, or the name he called his own. That's when my stepmother tries to call him back. "Honey man," she says, one hand on his cheek, the other his shoulder, settling him into the one chair he sometimes stays in. There are days she discovers him curled beneath the baby grand, and she's learned to lie down with him. "I am here," she says, her body caved against this man who every day deserts her. "Bats," he says, or maybe field glasses. Perhaps he's back in France, 1944, she doesn't know. But soon he's up again on his knees, shushing her, checking his headlamp, adjusting his knee pads, and she rises to her own knees. She doesn't know what else to do. The 2 of them, explorers, one whose thinning pin of light leads them, making their slow way through this room named for the living. Okay, so that was a couple of poems from Woman in the Painting, and then I'm going to read you a handful of poems from the new section of this book, the section I call Landscape with Female Figure. And the first one takes place in the Ozark Mountains, where my former husband and I bought land. We became back to the landers. I don't know if you know what that term is, but in the 1970s, late 1960s, and really the whole 1970s, people from the city, young people like us, went to places where they could buy land and build their own house and try to raise their own vegetables and animals, and we did our version of that. And so this poem takes place during the building of the house. It's on page 14. Every time her husband climbs a ladder, first the framing, then the roof beams, and the plywood, shingles, edging, roof vent, and now the gutters, she wants to pray him down. Not so he hears her and complains that builders cost money they don't have. They agreed he'd do it all himself. But sometimes she slips and says out loud, "Be careful." And he gives her the look of his that says, "I love you, but please don't tell me the obvious." Not that she hasn't saved them a few times on highways. As if it were nothing much to haul a 4x8 sheet of plywood up a 16-foot ladder and lift it over his head and slam it onto rafters, nail it in place as he squats on the roof, then goes down again for another. We take care with big things, but take small ones for granted, her father always warned. That's when accidents happen. Perhaps it's her father's voice she raises when her mouth opens against her better half. It's like that game she played as a kid, not stepping on cracks, believing a child would make a difference in a world where her mother could die of cancer, even though her father's a doctor. As if saying something now would force the gods, this time, to listen. And they did listen, because he didn't fall off the roof and nothing bad ever happened in building those houses. But what did happen is we got divorced. So I guess that's nothing to do with house building. One of the assignments I give myself just to keep writing, because I don't always, I'm not always inspired to, oh, suddenly I'm going to write a poem about this. And I was explaining this to students earlier today and talking about the fact that I just think of my writing as practice, the way you would practice the piano, practice playing basketball, practice, practice, practice. And I don't expect every time I sit down to write that I'm going to write a real poem or a good poem, but I do know that practice does help you towards the ease of getting something right when you are inspired. So one of the assignments I often give myself is that I would choose a color at random and see if I can write something that might express some essential aspect of that color emotionally or psychologically rather than scientifically. So this one is called Blue. It's on page 19. Also in the book is black and another one called ochre. So there are other colors in the book, not just blue. But this one's in the opening section. I take the laundry down from the line, and the line speaks to me. Gray line breaking the sky in two, each half blue, but one pale, the other darker than the ceramic bowl that broke this morning as I lifted it from the table after my cereal, without a hint of what would happen next. I lifted it, and it just split, the dribble of milk suddenly puddling on the formica like evidence, like white blood. I stood holding two useless half-truths in my hands, two blue half-truths, bluer than your blue eyes I grew so used to looking into. The break was clean, inevitable, hidden beneath the glaze of fissure that would someday crack the bowl apart. If you were reading this now, you'd say, she's talking about us again in her usual talk about something else way. And it's true, I do that all the time. Okay, I talked about being influenced by a novelist and a Latin poet, and I was also influenced by a contemporary poet. What happened was that when I first moved to Portland, Oregon, 11 years ago, another poet who knew me asked me if I knew this other poet who happened to be at the same reading, and I said, no, I don't know him. And she introduced us. His name is John Brehm. He's a very good poet. If you have never heard of him, B-R-E-H-M, I would suggest looking him up. He and I, when we met, realized that we lived about a 10-minute walk from one another. And so we arranged to meet for tea, and we brought books, and we traded books, and then I went home, and I was reading his first book, and I was struck by something about one of the poems, and I started to write him a note, and the note turned into this poem that you're about to hear. It's called Question. It's on page 38. Question. For and after John Brehm. I've been reading the poems in your first book between tasks or at the end of the day in bed in my nightshirt, sometimes tired, sometimes too awake, sometimes first thing in the morning. Still in bed just now, I read the one about clouds and wind and the way your mind leaps out of control like my mind, like all our minds. And I admire the way you guide me through all the leaps the poem takes without holding my hand, trusting my instincts, if not my intelligence. And you do it in one sentence without punctuation until the end. I almost wrote the very end, but thought how superfluous very is, since end is end, no matter what kind, and no adjective makes any difference, not even for emphasis. Someone is dead, not very dead, not very pregnant. or very divorced, as I am right now, and I might have used very in my own head, but not out loud or in a poem. The last word in your poem is you, meaning not you, but a woman, which is what the poem's focus finally is, though we don't reach that word for many lines. Yet I'm never confused in your one-sentence poem that I'm now imitating, if only to see where it will lead if I keep it up the way I kept up my part of my marriage, even after I learned that my ex did not. He pretended to, but isn't that the way these things go? When you finally relax and think how good this is, how easy to be yourself without fuss, without complaint, and then the clouds you were so grateful for in the Arkansas glare and heat turn out to be storm clouds, crouching over the Ozarks, about to devour everything in their wake, like a starving lion stalking the weakest in the herd. And along with the clouds, the train sound, that roar you were warned about without time to rush to the storm cellar, the train sound after such silence, and that wind, but no real train lifts the forest away like so many toothpicks, or rips off the roof of the carport, and with it, the new car. My heart felt like that, and may as well have been torn out, because when that happens, you don't need it, you don't want it, you want to be somewhere where you can't feel anything, not even if it's true that if you let yourself feel, you will get to the other side. The fact that there is another side to get to is hard enough to believe. The way the end of your poem, the clouds do what they want with you. You have no control, the way you have no control of the woman you want in your poem to stay, and she does not leave, at least not when you wrote the poem, although that was then and this is now, isn't it? Whew, that's hard to read. But you heard it, didn't you? You got it? Okay, good. Okay, so you probably want to know what happened after that, right? You heard a lot of details there. The very next poem in this book gives you a little information about that. So I did leave Arkansas, moved to Portland, Oregon, and this poem is called Anniversary. Last night, I set the dining room table he's never seen. He's never seen this apartment or the street where I live, or me without the 35 pounds I lost after the divorce, 1 pound for each of our years together. I took out the good silver and the Wedgwood we never used. I ate by candlelight, alone. I didn't mind. I didn't miss him. The river light brightened as the moon rose. I watched that, breathed in the fruity redolence of the Chardonnay, sipped. I ate a chicken breast marinated in champagne and limes. I ate white rice and fresh green beans from my neighbor's garden. I ate alone and wanted nothing. I didn't raise my glass. I did the one chore that used to be his. I liked the sound of the rinse water as I lifted the plate from the suds, the little clink as I set it into the dish drainer, the hum of the wine glass as I wiped it dry. I know now where the mind can take you when you stand by yourself in the kitchen after a good meal. Whatever comes next will happen anyway. Okay, I'm going to read 3 more poems, 1 more from the book and then the 2 new ones. This one is called Overture. 44 is the page number. And I think you don't really need an explanation. You'll hear what happens in the poem. Overture, Portland, Oregon, February 2012. So I stepped off the streetcar and walked to the bus stop, marveling at the city around me and at the young woman I could never be, standing as if beautiful, with her tattooed neck and metal studs through her nose and ears. And actually, she was beautiful, singing a familiar tune, its notes of grace filling the space between the 2 of us. And suddenly, too, a limping man with his cardboard will work for food sign, like the title of a poem and not his life. But who was he then? Because he began to hum, and the woman, teeth not yellow like him, smiling at him, reached into the breast pocket of her denim jacket while she sang, and fluttered a $5 bill toward him like some butterfly, which reminded me of my mother, who sang on the bed of her death as if song could keep her alive. Or maybe it was I who imagined this, a prayer not for the dead, but from the dying, my mother in her purple gown, singing as if death were not the name of anything, but part of an overture. Her brown eyes earnest like those of the woman at the bus stop in my new city, where I did not yet know who I would become, but now it seemed I was at least a singer at a bus stop, for my own voice joined in without my permission, and the three of us hovered in the mellifluous air on the darkening sidewalk as the bus came to us and lifted us together and away. So that was the last poem in this news section of the book. And the next book tentatively has got the title Against Melancholy. And it's really a book of really what happens next is all the good things that can happen in one's life. And so I'll read you two poems from that. The first one is called Music. Was it raining? Was it raining when you pulled the car to the curb to let me out and leaned toward me and kissed me, not the way I expected, but as if we were lovers, and I shook afterwards, shook as I sat in the passenger seat fiddling with the seatbelt. Was I still buckled in? Wasn't it raining? And the car, didn't it hum? Didn't the windshield wipers sweep across the glass like a bow across strings? Or was that the traffic? Or you? Was it you who hummed before I shut the car door? Or was it I alone? Did I do that? Should I be embarrassed? Ashamed? Or did we hum together? And after you drove away, was I that woman who stood on the curb of that crowded, wet street, wondering if it was music she heard? That silly woman who never opened her umbrella as the rain came down, pooling on the sidewalk, rushing over the curb. You see, I am capable of happy poems. And this last poem is called Pleasure. And before I read it, I just want you to know that the reputation that Portland, Oregon has of being a rainy, gray place is true. It's a rainy, gray place. I notice in my poems, the ones in the new book, there's so much rain in them. I thought, oh, yeah, in the wintertime we stay home, and yeah, what do? I write. So in the summertime, when we have some lovely temperatures in the 70s, yeah, I'm sure you're very envious of that, because here in Georgia, you don't have temperatures in the 70s in the summer. And we hardly have any humidity also. I shouldn't tell you that because you might move there and then we'll be very crowded. But there is a lot of rain. And it's really kind of misty rain, not really heavy rain. But so you just heard about rain in that poem, and there's going to be a little sense of what happens rain-wise in this one. And before I read it, I just want to thank you again for coming. I know that you have plenty of things to do, and it's very nice of you to be here. It's called Pleasure. Because yesterday I lay fully dressed, alone on my bed, listening to the sweet-tempered yatter of rain I'd longed for all summer, a timpani that continued for hours against the bedroom window. And because the dissonance of traffic on Southwest 6th was faint beneath it, the rain light and steady and close. And because yesterday it finally felt normal to sleep alone, wake and eat alone, walk out onto Madison Street on my own, deciding when and where to go without telling anyone. This morning, because I remembered the pleasure of yesterday's rain, yesterday's solitude, I showered and dressed. I finished my second cup, put the Times in the recycling bin under the sink, and took my time tidying the kitchen. And then, because I could, and because I no longer think of pleasure as something that must be shared, as I believed those 35 years of my marriage, I walked back down the hall, past the paintings my son made of our old life, And I stood a while admiring the brocade coverlet I bought my first winter alone, its intricate stitching, its pearl gray sheen. And slipping off my shoes, I lay down again and listened, even though there was no rain. Thank you.